Story 1. The Figure in the Fedora. Clara Bennett had worked as an ICU nurse for 7 years, her steady hands and sharp mind a beacon of reliability amid the chaos of the critical care unit. She prided herself on her skepticism. Ghosts, spirits, and shadowy figures belonged in campfire tales, not in the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of St. Mary's Hospital. Yet, as the autumn of 2024 faded into a bleak winter, something began to unravel her certainty, thread by thread. It started with a patient named Thomas Reed, a 62-year-old man with sunken cheeks and a failing heart. Late one night, as Clara adjusted his IV drip, he gripped her wrist with surprising strength for someone so frail. His cloudy eyes widened, darting toward the corner of the room. "He's there again," Thomas rasped, his voice trembling. "Tall, wearing a fedora. He's smiling at me." Clara followed his gaze, but the corner held nothing more than a metal chair and a flickering shadow cast by the overhead lights. She chalked it up to delirium. Morphine and exhaustion often played tricks on the mind. She murmured something reassuring, patted his hand, and moved on. Thomas passed away 2 days later, his final breath escaping just as the clock struck 3 in the morning. The incident might have faded from Clara's memory, a fleeting oddity in her demanding routine, if not for what happened next. A week later, another patient, Eleanor Grayson, a 70-year-old woman with pneumonia, began muttering about the same figure. Clara was charting vitals when Eleanor's frail voice broke the silence. "He's by the window now," she said, her tone eerily calm. "Tall man in a fedora. He's got a kind smile." Clara froze, her pen hovering over the clipboard. She glanced at the window, nothing but the black night beyond the glass, streaked with rain. "Who's there, Eleanor?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. The old woman turned her head slowly, her eyes glassy but certain. "He's here for me," she replied. Hours later, Eleanor slipped away peacefully, her monitor flatlining as Clara stood by, a chill creeping up her spine. The consistency unnerved her. Thomas and Eleanor had never met. Their rooms were on opposite ends of the unit, and neither was lucid enough to overhear gossip. Yet their descriptions aligned perfectly: a tall figure, a fedora, that unsettling smile. Clara tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with every shift. By mid-November, the pattern became impossible to ignore. A third patient, James Carter, a 48-year-old man recovering from a car accident, started talking about the figure. His condition had stabilized, and Clara had dared to hope he'd pull through. But one evening, as she checked his bandages, James grabbed her arm, his fingers cold and trembling. "He's standing right there," he whispered, nodding toward the foot of his bed. "Tall guy, fedora hat, smiling like he knows something I don't." Clara's stomach twisted. She forced a smile, her nurse's instincts kicking in. "It's just the meds, James. Try to rest." But his eyes stayed fixed on that empty space, wide with a mix of fear and fascination. The next morning, James coded unexpectedly. The team fought for 30 minutes to bring him back, but he was gone. Clara stood over his still form, her hands shaking as she signed the paperwork, the image of that invisible figure burning in her mind. She began to dread her night shifts. The hospital, once a place of order and purpose, now felt like a stage for something she couldn't explain. The hallways seemed longer, the shadows deeper, and the hum of machinery took on a sinister undertone. Clara confided in a colleague, Dr. Michael Torres, a pragmatic physician she'd known for years. "It's got to be some kind of shared hallucination," he suggested over coffee in the break room. "Near-death experiences mess with the brain. They're seeing what they want to see. Comfort, maybe." His logic made sense, but it didn't ease the tightness in her chest. Comfort didn't explain the specificity, the fedora, the smile. Then came Lillian Hayes, a 55-year-old cancer patient with a sharp wit despite her declining health. Clara liked her. Lillian's dry humor was a rare bright spot in the unit. One stormy night, as thunder rumbled outside, Lillian beckoned Clara closer. "You've seen him too, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low. Clara stiffened. "Seen who?" Lillian's lips curved into a knowing smile. "The man in the fedora. He's been here all week, just watching. Last night he tipped his hat to me." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't seen anything, not yet. But Lillian's certainty shook her. "He's not here to hurt anyone," Lillian added, her tone softening. "He's helping, I think." The next evening, Lillian passed away, her face serene as the rain tapped against the window. Clara couldn't sleep after that. She lay awake in her apartment, replaying every encounter, every word. Was it hope, as Lillian suggested? A guardian ushering souls to peace, or something darker, a harbinger cloaked in charm? She started noticing details she'd overlooked, the way the air seemed heavier when patients spoke of him, the faint scent of damp earth that lingered afterward. She wondered if she was losing her grip, if the stress of the job had finally cracked her. The breaking point came on December 20th, with a patient named Samuel Ortiz, a 39-year-old father of 2 fighting sepsis. He'd been stable for days, and Clara felt a flicker of optimism as she checked his chart. But that night, as she adjusted his oxygen, Samuel's eyes snapped open. "He's here," he said, his voice steady despite his fever. Tall, fedora, smiling. "He says it's time." Clara's heart pounded. "Who says?" she demanded, louder than she intended. Samuel pointed to the doorway, where the light from the hall cast a long, jagged shadow across the floor. "Him." She spun around, her pulse roaring in her ears. For a split second she thought she saw it, a silhouette, impossibly tall, the brim of a hat tilting slightly. She blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the empty doorway and the echo of her own breathing. Samuel died at dawn, his hand slipping from hers as the first light crept through the blinds. Clara stumbled out of the room, her mind reeling. She'd seen him, or had she? The line between reality and illusion blurred, and she couldn't tell if it was exhaustion or something more. She took a leave of absence the next day, unable to face the unit's sterile walls or the weight of that lingering presence. Months later, sitting in a quiet cafe on a crisp March morning in 2025, Clara still wrestled with what she'd witnessed. She'd returned to work eventually, but the figure in the fedora haunted her thoughts. Was he a figment of dying minds, a shared dream of peace? Or had she brushed against something real, something that waited patiently in the corners of the world? She didn't know, and perhaps she never would. But every so often, when the wind carried the faint scent of earth or a shadow stretched too long, Clara glanced over her shoulder, just in case. Story 2. The Shadow in the Room. In a quiet hospital room, the air hummed with the steady rhythm of machines, their soft beeps cutting through the stillness like a heartbeat. The walls, painted a stark white, reflected the dim glow of fluorescent lights, while the faint scent of antiseptic hung heavy. Sarah sat by her son Ethan's bedside, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes shadowed from nights without sleep. At 7 years old, Ethan was small for his age, his frail body dwarfed by the crisp sheets. Jessica, the nurse tending to him, moved with quiet precision, her hands steady as she adjusted the IV drip and checked his chart. Though her face remained calm, her heart ached for the boy and his mother. Ethan had been fighting a fierce infection for nearly a week. His fever had spiked and fallen like a restless tide, leaving him weak but awake at times. That evening, as Jessica scribbled notes on a clipboard, Ethan stirred. His eyes, wide and glassy, darted toward the corner of the room near the window, where a small table held a vase of drooping daisies. "Mom," he rasped, his voice thin and dry. "Who's that old lady over there? She looks so sad." Sarah's brow furrowed. She followed his gaze, but the corner was empty, just the table, the flowers, and a faint patch of moonlight spilling through the blinds. "There's no one there, honey," she said, brushing her fingers across his damp forehead. "You're tired. Maybe it's a dream." Ethan shook his head, wincing as he shifted under the blankets. No, she's there. She's got white hair and a blue dress. She's watching me. Sarah glanced at Jessica, who offered a reassuring smile. It could be the medicine, Jessica said softly. Sometimes it plays tricks on the mind. But Ethan's certainty didn't waver. She told me her name's Margaret, he murmured, his eyes fixed on the empty space. The name hit Sarah like a cold wind. Margaret was her mother's name, her mother who had died when Sarah was just 16, long before Ethan was born. He'd never heard her name spoken, never seen her face in a photograph. Sarah's breath caught. "That's not possible," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jessica tilted her head, sensing the shift in Sarah's tone. "What's not possible?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She just stared at the corner, as if willing herself to see what Ethan saw. Over the next few days, Ethan's condition grew worse. His fever climbed again, and his small body trembled with chills. The doctors adjusted his treatment, their faces tight with concern, while Sarah hovered by his side, whispering prayers under her breath. Jessica watched it all unfold, her own unease growing. She couldn't shake Ethan's words, or the way Sarah's expression had changed when he'd said that name. One rainy evening, as thunder rumbled outside, Sarah pulled a worn photo album from her tote bag. Her hands shook as she opened it, flipping to a page near the middle. "Jessica," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "look at this." Jessica stepped closer, peering over Sarah's shoulder. The photograph showed an older woman with gentle eyes and white hair pulled into a neat bun. She wore a simple blue dress, faded with age in the image. "This is my mother, Margaret," Sarah said. "She passed away years ago. Ethan's never seen her, not even in pictures." Jessica's stomach twisted. The woman in the photo matched Ethan's description perfectly. The white hair, the blue dress, the air of quiet sorrow. "That's remarkable," she managed, her voice faltering. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. He saw her. I don't know how, but he did. How could he know what she looked like? Jessica had no explanation. In her 8 years as a nurse, she'd heard strange stories, patients seeing loved ones at the edge of life, but she'd always dismissed them as fever dreams or coincidence. Now, doubt crept in. "Maybe there's something we don't understand," she said, her words feeling inadequate. "Something beyond what we can see." Sarah nodded, clutching the album to her chest. "I lost her so long ago. If she's here, maybe she's watching over him." As Ethan's infection lingered, Jessica found herself lingering too. She'd check on him more often than necessary, her eyes drifting to that empty corner. Once, late at night, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't belong, but when she blinked, it was gone. Then, slowly, Ethan began to mend. His fever broke for good, and color returned to his cheeks. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the window, Jessica sat beside him. He was awake, his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "Ethan," she asked gently, "can you tell me more about that old lady?" He smiled faintly. "She was nice. She said she's watching me, keeping me safe. She told me not to be scared." Jessica's throat tightened. "Did she say anything else?" "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice stronger now. "She said she loves me and that she'll always be close, even if I can't see her." Sarah, standing in the doorway, stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone with something like hope. "That's what my mother used to tell me," she said, "that she'd always be with me." Ethan reached for her hand. "She said she's my grandma." Sarah sank onto the bed, pulling him into her arms. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she held him tight. "Maybe she is, baby. Maybe she really is." Weeks later, Ethan was strong enough to leave the hospital. Sarah packed his things with a lightness Jessica hadn't seen before, a quiet peace settling over her. As they prepared to go, Sarah turned to Jessica. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with gratitude, "for everything. I think my mother was here somehow, looking after him." Jessica smiled, her own emotions tangled. "I'm just glad he's okay. Take care of each other." After they left, Jessica stood alone in the room, gazing out the window at the city below. The machines were silent now, the bed empty. She thought about Ethan's words, about the thin line between life and death, and how sometimes it seemed to blur. That night, in the hospital break room, Jessica pulled out her journal. Her coffee had gone cold, but she barely noticed as she wrote, "Today I saw something I can't explain. A boy named Ethan, fighting for his life, described his grandmother, a woman he'd never met. His mother showed me a photo, and it was her, down to the last detail. I've always trusted science, but this makes me wonder. Maybe there's a veil between this world and the next, and in our weakest moments, it thins. Maybe love doesn't end with death. I don't know what I believe anymore, but I'll never forget this." She closed the journal, her mind buzzing. The story spread quietly among the staff. A whispered tale of the boy who saw his grandmother, a mystery that lingered like a shadow in the corner. For Sarah and Ethan, it was a gift, a thread of connection to someone lost. For Jessica, it was a question, a crack in her certainty that would never fully close. And somewhere, perhaps, Margaret watched, unseen but ever present, her love stretching across the divide. Story 3. The Unseen Stain. It was a treacherous night, cloaked in rain and shadow, when Ethan's life veered off course. The downpour hammered the winding country road, turning it into a slick ribbon of danger. Ethan, a 22-year-old college student, was behind the wheel, exhaustion tugging at his senses after a marathon study session. The rhythmic thud of rain against the windshield dulled his focus, and his heavy eyelids battled to stay open. Out of the darkness, a deer bolted across the road, its eyes flashing in the headlights like twin beacons. Instinctively, Ethan yanked the steering wheel, but the car hydroplaned, spiraling wildly before smashing into a towering oak with a bone-jarring crunch. The front of the vehicle folded inward, a twisted heap of metal and glass. Paramedics descended on the scene in mere minutes, their movements frantic as they pried Ethan from the wreckage. His body bore the brutal marks of the crash, shattered bones, ruptured organs, a frame barely holding together. They raced him to the nearest trauma center, where the emergency team leapt into action, a well-oiled machine against the chaos of tragedy. Male, 22, motor vehicle collision, multiple traumas, barked a paramedic as Ethan's stretcher rolled into the trauma bay. Nurse Sarah, a battle-hardened ICU veteran, took charge with a steady hand. "Hook him up to the monitor. Start 2 large-bore IVs and order a trauma panel. Now!" she commanded, her voice cutting through the clamor. For hours, the team waged a desperate war to save him. Ethan's vitals flickered like a dying flame, blood pressure plunging, heartbeats stuttering into chaos. Surgeons labored over his broken form, stitching and clamping in a race against time, but the damage was relentless. Eventually, they stabilized him enough to transfer him to the ICU, where a ventilator breathed for him. Tests piled up. A CT scan painted a grim picture of catastrophic brain injury. Over the next 48 hours, his body slipped further away, and neurological assessments confirmed the worst. No brain activity remained. With heavy hearts, the team declared him brain dead. Later, as the dust of the ordeal settled, Sarah returned to the trauma bay to tidy up. Glancing upward, she froze. Crimson streaks marred the pristine white ceiling tiles, splattered in a chaotic arc directly above where Ethan had lain. Her pulse quickened as she summoned Dr. Martinez, her voice tight with confusion. "Take a look at this," she said, gesturing to the ceiling. "Where did that come from?" Dr. Martinez squinted, his brow furrowing. "That's not possible. We didn't have an arterial bleed or anything that could have done that." They examined Ethan's still form, searching for an answer, but no injury or procedure explained the bizarre display. The blood seemed to defy logic, as if it had materialized from thin air. "Could it be from someone else?" Sarah ventured, though she knew the room had been spotless before Ethan's arrival. "No chance," Dr. Martinez countered. "We inspect every inch before a patient comes in, and that pattern, it's like someone flung it up there on purpose." A shiver crawled up Sarah's spine. But who? And for what reason? Unnerved, they scrubbed the ceiling clean, but the enigma gnawed at them both. That night, as Sarah wrapped up her shift, the image of those scarlet streaks clung to her mind. She mentioned it to the night nurse, who brushed it off with a casual shrug. "Probably just some weird fluke," the nurse said, uninterested. Sarah wasn't so sure. The way the blood had arched across the ceiling felt deliberate, like a message scrawled in a language she couldn't decipher. After Ethan's body was wheeled to the morgue, Sarah found herself drawn back to the trauma bay. The room stood silent now, its sterile surfaces gleaming under the dim lights, the chaos of earlier erased. Yet stepping inside, she sensed a shift. The air turned frigid, thick with an unnatural stillness that pressed against her chest. She tilted her head to study the ceiling. The blood was gone, wiped away by diligent hands, but its ghost lingered in her memory, stirring a restless unease. Wrapping her arms around herself, she whispered, "Pull yourself together. It was nothing." But the words rang hollow. Something had transpired here, something that mocked the boundaries of science and reason. Alone in the shadowed bay, Sarah felt reality tremble beneath her feet. Then a sound, a faint, breathy murmur brushed her ear. She whirled around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" she called, her voice quaking. Only silence replied. As she turned to leave, her gaze snagged on a tiny, dark spot on the floor, a fresh drop of blood, glistening where nothing had been moments before. Panic surged through her, propelling her out of the room. She slammed the door and fled to the nurse's station, where the hum of voices and fluorescent glow banished the dread clawing at her. In the days that followed, Sarah wrestled with the inexplicable. She confided in a few colleagues, but their responses, stress, fatigue, imagination, offered no comfort. The memory of that cold room, the ceiling's crimson riddle, and the ghostly whisper refused to fade. One evening, as she crossed the hospital parking lot, a figure caught her eye, a shadowy silhouette standing motionless in the dusk. Its posture echoed Ethan's somehow, a haunting echo of the young man she'd lost. She blinked, and it vanished. Driving home, she tried to dismiss it as a trick of her weary mind, but doubt gnawed at her. That night, lying in bed, she stared at her own ceiling, wondering if Ethan's spirit lingered, reaching out through means she couldn't grasp. Months later, a rumor drifted to her from another hospital, a patient's death marked by unexplained blood in their room. Sarah pondered a link, a thread tying these mysteries together. Yet, she let it drop. Some truths, she decided, were too elusive to chase. The blood on the ceiling remained an enigma, a shiver in an otherwise mundane world. Still, whenever she passed that trauma bay, her eyes flicked upward, half braced to see those streaks again. They never returned, but their shadow clung to her, a quiet, chilling testament to the fragile line between life and the unknown beyond. Story 4. The Silent Witness Who Remembered. It was a chilly autumn evening when chaos erupted near Lake Serenity. A man, Michael Thompson, a 35-year-old architect with a quiet demeanor, had slipped on a slick rock during a solitary walk and plunged into the icy depths of the lake. The water swallowed him whole, and for over 20 minutes he remained submerged, lost to the world above. The rescue team arrived after a frantic call from a passerby, their boots crunching against the gravel shore as they launched into action. The scene was grim. The lake's surface was still, reflecting the fading twilight, and the air buzzed with the unspoken fear that they were too late. The rescuers, led by Captain Daniel Hayes, worked with desperate precision. 20 minutes is too long, Hayes muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the lapping waves. They hauled Michael's limp body from the water, his skin ghostly pale, lips tinged blue from the cold. Paramedics descended upon him, their hands moving in a blur. Chest compressions, oxygen masks, urgent shouts. There was no pulse, no breath, only the eerie stillness of a body that seemed beyond saving. Yet they persisted, loading him into the ambulance and speeding toward St. Mary's Hospital, where the ICU team awaited. In the sterile chaos of the ICU, Dr. Emily Carter took charge. A seasoned physician with a no-nonsense air, she surveyed Michael's lifeless form with a furrowed brow. "He's been down for too long," she said to her team, her tone clipped but resolute. "Still, we've got to try everything." They hooked him to a ventilator, draped him in warming blankets to fight the hypothermia that gripped his core, and prepped the defibrillator. Nurse Sarah Mitchell, a compassionate veteran of the ward, assisted silently, her hands steady despite the sinking feeling in her chest. As she adjusted the monitors, a private thought flickered through her mind. This man isn't going to pull through. She buried it deep, focusing instead on the task at hand. The defibrillator hummed to life, its sharp jolt rocking Michael's body. Once, twice, 3 times. The team held their breath, eyes glued to the monitor. Then, a miracle. A faint, erratic blip appeared. "We've got a pulse!" Dr. Carter exclaimed, her voice cutting through the tension. But Michael didn't stir. His heart beat, yet his mind remained locked in a void, and he slipped into a coma. For the next 2 weeks, he lay motionless in his hospital bed, a fragile thread of life sustained by machines. His wife, Laura, and their 2 children, a 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, and a 4-year-old son, Ethan, kept vigil by his side. Laura clutched his hand, her whispers a soft plea. "Come back to us, Michael." The children left drawings by his bedside, stick figures of their family under a bright sun. The medical staff adjusted his care with meticulous attention, but no one could predict if, or when, he'd awaken. Yet within the stillness of Michael's coma, something extraordinary unfolded. His body was inert, but his consciousness roamed free. He drifted in a boundless expanse, a dark yet strangely comforting void. Voices filtered through, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. He heard the paramedics' urgency, Dr. Carter's grim assessment, and Sarah's unspoken doubt. He felt the searing shock of the defibrillator, the chill of the ICU room seeping into his bones, the gentle pressure of Laura's hand. Once, as Sarah adjusted his IV, he sensed her quiet wish. "I hope he's not alone in there." Trapped in silence, he longed to respond, to tell her he wasn't. Days bled into weeks, and slowly Michael's awareness sharpened. The void receded, replaced by the hum of machines, the rustle of sheets, the soft footsteps of nurses. Then, on a quiet morning, his eyelids fluttered. Laura, dozing in a chair beside him, jolted awake. "Michael," she breathed, her voice trembling. He turned his head, eyes bleary but alive. "Hey," he rasped, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Sophie and Ethan rushed in later, their squeals of joy echoing through the ward. The medical team descended, running tests to confirm his recovery. But what Michael said next turned their astonishment into disbelief. "I remember it all," he began, his voice weak but steady. "The lake, the rescue, the hospital. I felt the defibrillator, heard you talking. Dr. Carter, you said I'd been down too long. Sarah, you thought I wouldn't make it, but you stayed with me." Dr. Carter frowned, exchanging a glance with Sarah. "That's not possible," she said gently. "You were unconscious the entire time." Michael shook his head. "I heard your thoughts, felt the coldness of the room. I knew Laura was here and the kids. I even sensed their drawings. It was like I was watching it all, even though I couldn't move." Sarah's face paled. "How could you know what I thought?" she whispered, her hand trembling slightly. "I don't know," Michael admitted, "but I did. And thank you, Sarah, for not leaving me alone." As he recovered, Michael's revelations rippled through the hospital. He recounted details with uncanny precision, the paramedics' shouts, The antiseptic scent of the ICU, the exact words of a late-night conversation between two orderlies. Dr. Carter, a skeptic by nature, ordered neurological scans, but they revealed nothing abnormal. "This defies everything we understand about comas," she confided to a colleague. "Could consciousness linger when we assume it's gone?" The hospital chaplain, Father Thomas, offered another perspective. "It's a near-death experience," he told Michael during a visit. "People often describe heightened awareness, a sense of being outside their bodies. You're not alone in this." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "I didn't see lights or tunnels, but I was there, aware somehow." The experience reshaped those around him. Laura wept with relief, but wrestled with the mystery of where her husband had been. The medical staff debated late into the night, their scientific certainties shaken. Michael himself felt transformed, his brush with death igniting a hunger to understand what he'd endured. He devoured books on consciousness, attended lectures, and connected with others who'd glimpsed beyond the veil. One such connection led him to Dr. Alex Nguyen, a neuroscientist studying anomalous brain activity. Intrigued, Dr. Nguyen tested Michael, mapping his brain waves as he relived his coma. "These patterns are unprecedented," Nguyen marveled. "Your mind was active in ways we can't yet explain." Inspired, Michael turned his ordeal into purpose. He founded a foundation to support coma patients, advocating for their care and funding research into consciousness. He volunteered at St. Mary's, sitting with the unconscious, speaking to them as Sarah once had to him. "They might hear us," he'd say. "We can't assume they're gone." Weeks after his discharge, Michael returned to the ICU one last time before fully resuming his life. Spotting Sarah adjusting a patient's chart, he approached her. "I'm back to give back," he said, smiling. "Your kindness kept me tethered. I want to do that for others." Sarah's eyes glistened. "You're incredible, Michael. They'll feel it, just like you did." Stepping into the sunlight outside, Michael carried a new truth. Life's greatest mysteries, like consciousness itself, defied easy answers. But in the quiet presence of compassion, even the silent could find their way home. Story 5. The Haunted Gurney. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of St. Augustine Hospital's intensive care unit, whispers lingered about a particular gurney, Bed 7. It wasn't the sleek modern design or the faint creak of its wheels that set it apart. It was the chilling reputation it had earned over the years. Among the staff, hushed rumors painted it as a harbinger of doom. Patients assigned to Bed 7, they said, either encountered inexplicable disturbances or never left the room alive. The tales varied. Some spoke of fleeting shadows, others of voices murmuring in the stillness. But the outcome was often the same, a quiet, final breath in the dead of night. Emma Carter, a seasoned nurse with a no-nonsense attitude, had heard the stories countless times during her 12 years at the hospital. She dismissed them as superstitions born from exhaustion and grief. To her, Bed 7 was just another piece of equipment, no different from the ventilators or IV stands. That was until one stormy evening in late March, when she was assigned to monitor a new patient placed in that very spot. The patient was Daniel Grayson, a 43-year-old man admitted after a severe car accident. His chart detailed a fractured skull and internal bleeding, but the surgeons had stabilized him, or so they thought. As Emma pushed through the double doors into the ICU, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the metallic tang of antiseptic and something she couldn't quite place. Rain lashed against the windows, casting jagged shadows across the linoleum floor. She approached Bed 7, where Daniel lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the ventilator's mechanical hiss. At first, everything seemed routine. Emma adjusted the drip on his IV, checked his vitals, and scribbled notes on her clipboard. The storm outside roared on, thunder rattling the glass panes. Then, as she turned to dim the overhead light, a faint sound pricked her ears, a whisper, soft and unintelligible, like a breath carried on the wind. She froze, her hand hovering over the switch. The room was silent save for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the rain's relentless drumming. Shaking her head, she chalked it up to fatigue. 12-hour shifts had a way of playing tricks on the mind. But as the night wore on, the unease grew. Daniel began to stir, his fingers twitching against the crisp white sheets. His eyelids fluttered, though he remained unconscious, and a low groan escaped his lips. Emma leaned closer, checking his pupils with her pen light. That's when she saw it, a flicker of movement at the foot of the bed. A shadow, tall and indistinct, loomed there for a heartbeat before vanishing as lightning illuminated the room. Her pulse quickened. She stepped back, scanning the empty space. Nothing. No one. Just the storm's wild dance beyond the glass. Over the next few hours, the strange occurrences piled up. The whispers returned, louder now, weaving through the air like threads of a forgotten conversation. Emma couldn't make out the words, but they carried a weight that pressed against her chest. Daniel's restlessness intensified. He thrashed weakly, as if fighting an unseen force. At one point, the heart monitor spiked inexplicably, its shrill alarm piercing the quiet before settling back to normal. Each time Emma tried to rationalize it, faulty equipment, a draft, her own imagination, the room seemed to push back, as if daring her to believe. Around 3 a.m, she couldn't take it anymore. She slipped into the break room, where 2 other nurses, Sarah and Javier, sipped coffee under the hum of a flickering bulb. Their faces were drawn, eyes shadowed from too many late nights. Emma hesitated, then blurted out, "Have you ever noticed anything off about bed 7? Sarah's cup paused midway to her lips. Javier let out a dry laugh, but it lacked humor. "You mean the ghost bed?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, we've all got stories." Sarah set her cup down, her voice low. "Last month I had a patient there, Mrs. Holloway, 82, pneumonia. She kept saying she saw a man in a black coat standing by her feet. I thought it was delirium, but she described him down to the buttons on his sleeves. She died that night, flatlined out of nowhere." Javier nodded. 2 years ago, I had a guy who swore something was sitting on his chest, kept clawing at the air. He didn't make it to morning either. And the whispers, everyone hears them eventually. Emma's stomach twisted. She wanted to argue, to cling to her skepticism, but the memory of that shadow gnawed at her. Returning to Daniel's room, she found him still, his breathing shallow but steady. The whispers had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt alive, watchful. She sank into the chair beside him, determined to stay until her shift ended at 7. As dawn crept closer, painting the sky a sickly gray, Daniel's condition deteriorated. His vitals plummeted, and despite Emma's efforts, chest compressions, a crash cart, a frantic call for the doctor, he slipped away just as the first rays of light breached the horizon. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but Emma knew better. Bed 7 had claimed another. In the days that followed, she couldn't shake the experience. She began asking around, piecing together fragments of the gurney's history. An orderly told her it had come from an old wing of the hospital, abandoned after a fire 30 years prior. A janitor swore he'd seen it roll an inch on its own once, though he'd been half asleep at the time. The older nurses spoke of a doctor, a stern man in a dark coat, who'd worked the ICU decades ago, obsessed with his patient's survival to a fault. Some said he'd died in that fire, his spirit tethered to the bed he'd fought so hard to keep occupied. Emma requested a transfer to the pediatric ward soon after, unable to face bed 7 again. But the stories persisted. A week later, a new patient, a 29-year-old woman named Lila, was placed there after emergency surgery. Her nurse, a rookie named Tom, reported the same whispers, the same twitching, and a shadow that lingered just out of sight. Lila survived, but only after a night of delirium, ranting about a man who wouldn't let her rest. Others weren't so lucky. 3 more patients cycled through in the following month. 2 didn't see sunrise. By mid-April, the staff had taken to avoiding Bed 7 when possible, leaving it empty unless the ICU overflowed. Yet it sat there, pristine and unassuming, its metal frame gleaming under the harsh lights. The whispers, the shadows, the restless nights, they waited, patient and inevitable, for the next soul to lie upon it. And in the quiet hours, when the storm raged and the hospital slept, some swore they saw a figure in a black coat pacing the room, his presence a silent promise that Bed 7 would never rest empty for long.